This episode is brought to you by Cheerios Oat Crunch. Make a good morning great with Cheerios Oat Crunch Almond. Topped with whole grain oats and sliced almonds, it's a breakfast your whole family will love. Pick up your box of the new Cheerios Oat Crunch Almond at your local grocery store.
This episode is brought to you by Disney Plus. Disney Plus, Hulu, ESPN Plus? Stream all your favorites with the Disney Bundle. Disney Plus has Loki and Luca. On Hulu, watch originals like American Horror Story and 9 Perfect Strangers. And ESPN Plus has every match of Spain's thrilling La Liga. Get the Disney Bundle today for only $13.99. Includes Hulu ad-supported plan. Access content from each service separately. Terms apply. See thedisneybundle.com for details. This episode is brought to you by Shell. From the time you get up to the time you wrap up, there's a lot to do. So, at Shell, get 3 things done at once. Fill up with Shell gasoline, which is scientifically proven to help improve your mileage. Then, save on gas and snacks with fuel rewards and in-store rewards. Make the most out of your stop with Shell. Compared to minimum detergent gasoline, measured using industry standard and Shell proprietary tests. Helps to protect key fuel system components such as intake valves from the buildup of performance-robbing deposits. Actual effects and benefits may vary according to vehicle type, driving conditions, and driving style.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Topher, Principal Architect of Topher Architecture, and you're listening to New Books Architecture, the podcast channel in the New Books Network dedicated to architecture and its publications. If you have any suggestions on authors who would love to hear me speak with next, feel free to send me an email at btopher@topherarchitecture.com. Today's guest is Patrick Reardon to talk about his book, The Loop, The L-Tracks That Shaped and Saved Chicago. Patrick was an urban affairs writer, a feature writer, a columnist, and an editor for the Chicago Tribune for the last 30 years. Patrick, thank you for being here and talking with me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So before we begin, can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself?
Well, I'm born and raised in Chicago. I really love the city. I had a perfect job working at the Chicago Tribune for 32 years. Covering urban affairs most of the time, and that meant covering the whole range of issues in Chicago because everything's so interrelated: politics and development and planning and demographics. And so I'm very aware of how physical structures like the elevated loop impact the city. In ways that are beyond what they're there for. The elevated loop was built for a transit reason, but it had lots of impact. So that's the sort of stuff I'm interested in, the story behind the story, the deeper story, whenever I'm doing research on anything.
And so the first question I usually ask, particularly with this kind of book, is, and you've kind of hinted at it already in your intro there, but so what specifically about not only this city, but this specific part of the city were you interested in? What led you to write this book?
Well, when I left the Tribune, when I was at the Tribune, I always had an idea of wanting to write a book about Chicago. So I came up with an idea of one book about Chicago that I was starting to research, which I never got to. But part of the research was I had to settle a question that had been up in the air, and I'd looked into a little bit when I was at the Tribune, but couldn't answer it. And it was the question of how did Chicago's downtown come to be named the Loop? And what was really distressing, actually, was that I grew up in Chicago, and anybody who grew up in Chicago just knew that the name the Loop came from the elevated loop, because the downtown is circled by the elevated loop. And yet, there's this the last half century, historians have been lecturing Chicagoans on what they thought was a fact, that the elevated loop had nothing to do with the naming of the downtown, that it actually came from a cable car loop from 1882. Now, 1882 was 15 years before the elevated loop was built. So what historians, and when I say historians, I mean dozens of historians would put this in their books, saying that this cable car loop or some cable car loop had given the name to the downtown before the elevated loop was built. So as a reporter, any question that you don't have an answer to, it really gnaws at you. The problem is, when I was a reporter at the Tribune, I didn't have time to look into it. But when I was working on this pretty much full time, I realized, well, there's a way that I could do it. First of all, the Tribune, the entire collection of Tribune archives are online through the Chicago Public Library. So I could look at every story mentioning loop from 1882 through 1897 and beyond. It actually had to go beyond that to see if the downtown was ever called the Loop, because there were other newspapers in Chicago at the time, but there's no collection of any one particular paper that covers the whole period except the Tribune. And the Tribune was the most that worked the hardest to cover it. So what it meant was reading thousands of Tribune stories from 1882 to 1897 and beyond in order to see if the downtown was ever called the Loop. And it never was. But it took all this time to look at it. Now, that wasn't the only piece. I also looked at contemporary novels, memoirs, contemporary nonfiction books, and none of them talk about the downtown as the Loop. What had happened with the historians was that there got to be this thing where they all just knew it was true. It was kind of accepted wisdom that somebody had at one point written that the downtown was named the Loop because of a cable car, and they all just kept picking it up. And when you look at their sources, their sources just don't prove it. So anyway, so I got through proving that the downtown got its name Loop from the elevated loop. But in doing that, I realized, why did the name Loop get applied to the downtown? And it was because the elevated loop was so significant to Chicago in 1897 and afterwards that people began calling the downtown the Loop because of its importance to them and its physical presence. I mean, you've got this steel and wood structure that's a rectangle around 39 blocks of downtown, 39 or 38, I'm forgetting offhand. And when you're standing on the ground and these trains go by, it's loud and it screeches, and it's just, you can't avoid it. It is just a big deal. And so what happened was, as I realized, is that the people in the downtown started talking about the elevated loop as a way of designating where the downtown was. And there was a progression of phrases that were used in the period from 1897 to 1911, 1912 that show the progression of the way people talked about it. And I'll go into that right now if you want to, I'll try to keep it real quick.
Absolutely.
First of all, this thing is so big and it's so, intrusive on the landscape in a positive and a negative way, that people started immediately talked about, well, the land within the elevated loop or outside the elevated loop. So this was a term, but that's kind of clunky, within the elevated loop or outside the elevated loop. So then it evolved to another phrase of within the loop, meaning within the circle of tracks. And then it was in the loop district, so the area inside. So suddenly it moved away from the tracks and just was identified as the land inside the tracks. And eventually Loop District got shortened to Loop. And so the reason for this is
right.
This is like the same thing happened in Chicago 100 years later when the Millennium Park was finished in the early 2000s, and there was this sculpture that was put there that was called Cloud Gate. Well, everybody looked at it and said, "Oh, it's the bean." They named it the Bean because it looked like the bean. And the same thing happened with Rodin's sculptures. The Thinker was not called The Thinker by Rodin. It was called Dante or the poet, I think.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, what this indicates is the way that people reacted to this elevated loop was, and using it as a reference was an indication of how important it was. And it was important financially, it was important transportationally, and then ultimately in the long run, it was important when the suburbanization of the city took place, or of the nation took place after World War II. But that's a kind of long explanation for how I got into this book.
Great. And so you mentioned that, how important, and of course we're going to dive into its significance of being more than just an elevated track, which of course you make a good job proving. But I think there's some interesting parallels that could be drawn between this and what came to my mind was the Eiffel Tower. Very recognizable thing. Everyone's very used to it and it's iconic. However, just looking into its history, there was a period of time where it was almost hated, kind of rejected and fought against. Like I said, just like the Eiffel Tower.
Well, that's the fascinating thing as a reporter and as a historian. You love to find something that hasn't been found before, and the fact is, people didn't realize how significant the elevated loop was. At least the people in general, and the power brokers, the people who the movers and shakers in the city. Because they were the ones that kept wanting to tear it down, because the key fact of this is, even before it was finished, the land within the tracks, or the area that would be covered by the tracks, was worth significantly more than the land outside the tracks. So by building this, you created the high value land in that area. Everything outside the elevated loop was worth a lot less money than the land inside. And this was so significant that for about 10 or 20 years, real estate guys were jockeying to try to get the elevated loop structure extended further south. So if you could have extended two blocks further south, all that land would suddenly be in the loop and it would be suddenly worth a lot. If you extended it, 4 blocks south, the same thing. And these guys would all have, and I'm saying guys because they were all guys in 100 years ago. they had land there, and so they wanted, if you could just stretch it out, then suddenly the land in there would be worth something. However, if you have land inside the elevated loop, you don't want to get it stretched out, because that's going to pull the loop further south, and so your land maybe on the west part of the loop won't be as valuable as it would be the way it was. So first of all, it was this real estate value that made it so important. Secondly, the elevated loop was a transportation hub that had not been there before. There were 4 elevated lines that came into the downtown, and they all stopped several blocks outside of the downtown. The reason for that was that the city council and the business owners didn't want big L tracks crisscrossing the downtown the way the cable car loops had crisscrossed the downtown. The cable car loops were not intrusive. They were just a hole in the street where the cable came through. So it didn't get in the way. But if you can imagine, 4 different railroad lines coming in and making their own loops, I mean, the entire downtown would have been covered by a loop. So they decided they needed one elevated loop, and they didn't have the willpower to make it happen until Charles Yerkes stepped in and by sheer force of his own will and a lot of deviousness actually, was able to get it built. And once it was built, suddenly, if you were on the far north side of Chicago, you could get on an L train and take it down into the loop, switch trains and go all the way to the far south side or all the way to the far west side. So what the elevated loop did was create this transportation center that made that made it possible that tied together the city in a way it hadn't been tied before. You weren't isolated on the north side. You could go to the south side or the west side by just going into the loop. So this is how important the thing was, and yet the movers and shakers for years were trying to get it torn down again to open it up so that other development could be put in there would be more land that would be considered valuable land. The thing that they didn't realize is once you take down the elevated loop, there's no focus of the development, and so downtowns tend to wander. And what would have happened there would have been this kind of this sprawl of downtown, which would have meant that there wasn't the concentration of value that there was with the elevated loop. Does that make sense?
It does. It's an interesting point, though. You mentioned that it sort of contained the downtown, kept it from sprawl. In fact, I think you mentioned that quite a few visitors from New York always remarked at how small and congested their urban core is versus New York City.
Right.
But a question I have is, I think later on in the book you do mention that the advancement, of public transportation did kind of increase the size of the metropolitan area, and it kind of encouraged suburban sprawl, I guess, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Well, yeah, it was the highways. It was the post World War II highways that fed the suburban sprawl. That's another example of you build a highway, you build a physical thing, but it has this impact on the way people live and the way people operated. And when that happened, of course, across the nation, big cities like Cleveland and Detroit, places like Phoenix and Omaha, their downtowns basically disappeared. They just shrunk to nothing because all the businesses fled out to the suburbs, to the malls, because that's where the people with money were. In Chicago, that didn't happen because so much money was invested in that downtown land that people couldn't walk away from it the way they could in Cleveland or Detroit.
Interesting. And so you had mentioned the idea of unifying the city, and I want to come back to that. But I think one thing that's worth talking about, you had mentioned the name Charles Yerkes. Am I saying that right?
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
Charles Yerkes.
I know, another parallel could be drawn here. I think a lot of people, have read Power Broker, and they're familiar with Robert Moses and how his corruption helped shape New York City. I personally had never heard of Charles Yerkes, and after reading the book, it's kind of clear that he needs a book all on his own because he did something very similar. And his impact in Chicago, I think, has been kind of unknown for a while.
Well, his impact on Chicago's been known in a way, but it's been known of him as a bad guy.
Negatively.
I mean, Harold Ickes, who was on Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, who had his young adulthood in Chicago, described Yerkes. Now listen to this. He describes Yerkes, who was basically a rich guy who was a bit corrupt, but so were a lot of other guys. But he describes Yerkes as the equivalent of the 3 World War II enemy leaders, Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler. Now, I'm sorry, nobody is that bad. And Yerkes definitely wasn't that bad because not only did he set up the elevated loop, which radically changed the nature of the transportation system in Chicago, and as a result, radically changed Chicago. He then went to London and put in the new level of the tube, or started that work that had been stymied for years and would not have happened if he had not gone to London. He bought 4 subway companies that had the permission to create subways, but had not done anything because they couldn't get their funding together. He got the funding together, got it all started, and then died. but even though he died, the stuff he started got finished. And so if you've ever been to London, if you can picture what it would be like to try to get around without the tube, especially in the center part of the city, there were 2 tube lines before Yerkes got there, but those didn't go into the center of the city. The 4 lines he started served the center of the city and a much bigger area. So London would be a much different city today if Yerkes hadn't been there, and Chicago would be a much different city today if Yerkes hadn't been here.
Right. And so I know, and maybe we'll talk about a little bit, kind of how things changed radically in his tenure of Chicago. But I think another figure that you bring up in the book that I guess Yerkes was maybe remembered incorrectly in your opinion, but a figure you bring up a lot who doesn't seem to be remembered at all is the actual engineer and designer of this iconic elevated track.
Right.
John Waddell, I believe.
Yeah. John Lowe Alexander Waddell. And the reason, this is a guy who was a huge character. All the pictures of him show him with these curly mustaches and curly hair atop his head. The only thing I've ever seen comparable to that are some of the Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz. In other words, he was flamboyant, and he would wear all these decorations he got from foreign countries, foreign governments, because of bridges he had built. He was a foremost bridge builder. In fact, he's still remembered today by engineers as a major figure in bridge building internationally at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So when he died, the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune each had obituaries for him talking about how significant he was as a bridge builder. But nobody mentioned the fact that he had designed the elevated loop. And the elevated loop is designed in certain ways. I mean, this was a guy whose personality was so huge and his energy was so huge. When he got hired to design the elevated loop, he went to New York, which had the biggest elevated system at that time, and studied it to the point where he was able to design the elevated loop in Chicago in ways that avoided a lot of the problems that New York had. And when he wrote a paper about how bad New York was and how good Chicago was, there were a lot of other engineers who jumped in to comment, and he went back and forth with them. He just loved it. So anyway, there's this big personality, and he's been missing from Chicago history. And I think I never found any references to him in any of the papers except for a bridge that he had done in Chicago about 8 years earlier, which was a breakthrough bridge, but that's a whole other topic. But this guy was this wonderful character to find, and because he was so unknown, he was a great contrast to Yerkes, who was completely well known, but and known rightly as a corrupt guy, but the way that Yerkes shaped the city was totally overlooked. So anyway, these two guys were just wonderful to find when I was doing the research, and just to run with them. It was like, if you're writing something, you really want to tell people something they didn't know. And to tell them who Waddell was a great thing to tell them. And then to tell them that Yerkes wasn't as much of a demon or only a demon as everybody had made him out to be was also a lot of fun.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football is back, and the best bet you can make is downloading the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It doesn't matter if you're new to gambling or an old pro, FanDuel has something for everyone. And as an official sports betting partner of the NFL, you know your bets are safe. There's also never been a better time to use FanDuel, because right now, you'll get up to $1,000 back if your first bet doesn't win. You can even turn a small wager into a big payday with a same-game parlay bet. Just sign up with the promo code Spotify to place your first bet risk-free on FanDuel Sportsbook. Download FanDuel today. 21 plus and present in Virginia. First online real money wager only. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
This episode is brought to you by HP. Whenever you do your best thinking, the HP Spectre X360 is ready when inspiration strikes. With power save for battery life and focus mode to multitask, you can do your best thinking whenever and wherever it happens. You can't always schedule when and where you might have a brilliant thought, whether it's in the morning or before bed, when you're at your computer or away from it. Thinking can happen anywhere and anytime. The HP Spectre X360 2-in-1 convertible PC with Windows 10 saves battery life for whenever an idea hits you. HP Spectre X360, a more thoughtful laptop.
Absolutely. I would read a book about Waddle. You had mentioned he offended almost every New York engineer. If I recall, he did the same thing with English engineers when he was a faculty at Japan with a similar essay.
He wrote a book telling the Japanese in a very nice way that all your bridges are crap, but it's not your fault.
Yeah.
It's because you were listening to those English engineers.
So, like I said, I mean, to kind of go back to it, it was great to read about him. Again, I personally was not aware of him. Same with, of course, the book is more about the social aspect of it. But it's interesting, I guess, as a practicing architect, to hear that this engineering marvel doesn't use cross bracing so people could walk through. To me, that's crazy. But of course, he did it in a way that it works. And then I believe you mentioned that almost like 80% of the original structure is still functioning after all these decades. I don't think many of our buildings nowadays could.
Yeah.
75%.
Yeah.
Which is something I don't think most of our buildings nowadays could aim for.
Right.
And so I wanted to come back to, you had mentioned the idea of kind of unity, like you said, at first it was built as just a big elevated train. And I'm sure they didn't realize the impact it would have, but there is kind of a very long lasting impact that it unified that area a little bit. I was wondering, you had mentioned that Chicago is a city of, and I'll take a quote right here, of sharp divisions. I was wondering if you'd elaborate on that a little more.
Well, that is the thing. It's not only did it unify Chicago in a transportation way, and not only did it isolate this very valuable property, but it made this the center of Chicago in a way that every Chicagoan knew this was the center of Chicago, and everyone, to one extent or another, felt that it was their second neighborhood or wanted to feel that way. And the reason I'm putting that qualifier in there, and this was the thing I should have had in the book, and I brain freeze, didn't get it in. If you were very poor or if you were African American, you couldn't go down to the Loop as easily. You couldn't shop as easily as anybody who was white. So it was a bad thing in that way. But otherwise, African Americans got lots of jobs downtown. this was the place that Chicagoans felt they were comfortable in, and because of all the divisions in Chicago, and in Chicago, in these times, if you walked across the street, you'd be in another neighborhood that maybe the ethnic makeup was different from yours, and you get hit in the head with a brick. That's what Mike Royko used to say. So you felt comfortable in your own neighborhood, but you were a little bit anxious whenever you were anywhere else. The only exception was the downtown loop. When you'd come to the loop, you'd go to movies, you'd go to dinner, you'd shop, you'd go to the city hall to get your marriage license, or go to the court to pay your parking fines. Or anyway, it was and it still is the center of Chicago. It's not the same way in the sense of the movie theaters have pretty much gone. A lot of the shopping has moved up to Michigan Avenue, but Michigan Avenue is simply an extension of the loop downtown. What the loop downtown was and still is this center around which more development has happened on the outskirts, and so there's this great concentration of tall buildings that's really striking, especially when you look at it in comparison to Manhattan, where there's a concentration of tall buildings on the south end of the island, and then a concentration of tall buildings in the middle of the island, right next to the park.
Right. You make the comparison that New York has kind of a spiky outline, whereas Chicago has kind of a mountain range for their skyscrapers.
Right. Yeah. There was a really helpful book by a woman named Willis. I'm looking to see if I can spot it here on my shelf. I'm not spotting it right offhand, but she wrote a book about the different ways skyscrapers were built in Chicago and in New York, and that was just wonderful because it helped me understand the difference between the two places. But the bigger thing is that if you're in Manhattan and ask somebody which way to downtown, nobody will know what you're talking about, because there isn't an actual downtown. There are two financial centers. There are two business centers, but it's the whole island is kind of like itself. I mean, that's A.J. Liebling, who wrote this wonderful book, wonderfully sarcastic book in 1951, Chicago, the Second City. He just made fun of Chicago over and over again. And he made fun of the Loop because it was this small concentrated thing. It wasn't like Manhattan where, there was development rolling and rolling and rolling. And he also added, he was honest enough to add, but my friends, one of my friends who's fairly smart said that when he was in World War II and he was away in the service, what he would remember would be about Chicago was the elevated loop and the sounds of the police whistles and the elevated train and all. Anyway, it was he was willing. Liebling was willing to recognize that there was a romantic, sentimental feel to the downtown loop that there wasn't in the same way for Manhattan.
Right. And so we talked about kind of there was a period before it was accepted of, kind of opposition and people not wanting it. And then, however, I'd love to talk about the other end of the spectrum, that when it was sort of accepted, everyone took to it in the extreme sense as well. You have a whole chapter on the fact that it sounds like the city tried to plan everything around these concepts of loops.
Well, that was you got to remember in the 1890s when or 1880s and 1890s when the cable car loop was instituted. That was a new technical term. What a cable car loop, the cable car would come downtown and go around a block and then head south. So just it turned it around because there wasn't room for a turntable the way there is in San Francisco. So what happened was there was this kind of every transportation thing ended up people were looking for loops, trying to create loops, bicycle loops and pedestrian loops. And
Right.
in one case, there was a thought of having an elevated loop with a bicycle loop on the roof of
Yep.
the train structure. So there was this. So loop as an idea started with the cable cars as a technical thing, and then it got adapted to all these other things. And and as I said earlier, the cable car loops in the downtown, there eventually were 6 of them, and so each of them would only circle a block or two, and like I said, they were the cable car slit in the street was unintrusive. It was you could walk over it. It didn't look, you didn't see it. But the thought that each of these elevated loop companies would come and do the same thing downtown was what really scared off the movers and shakers and forced them to decide we're going to have to work together on this, and then eventually decide to work with Charles Yerkes.
And of course, there's an entire history there that I guess we'll talk about. Where Yerkes, you had mentioned, you were honest that he has been corrupt and he was used to kind of being in the driver's seat, I believe you quoted. Whereas when it came time for this effort, he found a lot more opposition than he was used to, even from some of the corrupt politicians he had worked with previously. Am I correct?
Yeah. That, in fact, he was able to get the elevated loop done, and so it was finished in early October 1897, and it just started. There was no ceremony, there was no ribbon cutting there, and that's like highly unusual in Chicago. When the first cable car train ran, there were politicians riding that car. Everybody was all over the place. And Chicago was having parades and celebrations for just about everything. The people coming back from the Spanish-American War were given parades and all this. So Yerkes was not given a parade. That's because at that time, even though he had finished the elevated loop, people were walking around the downtown area wearing on their lapels little hangman's nooses, because people were talking about lynching Yerkes because he was trying to sell his cable car franchises. Well, actually, he was trying to get the cable car franchises extended for 100 years, or as people said, a perpetual franchise. And so all the reformers were congregating against him, and they were joined by about half of the corrupt politicians who saw a way of getting an in on things. And so there were meetings after meetings where, like, the governor of the state talked about hanging Yerkes. The mayor of the city talked about hanging Yerkes. I mean, this was, and when you
right
look
from a lamppost, right?
Well, so everybody was talking about lynching Yerkes, and at the time, they were kind of overstating things. But this was a period in the nation when lynchings were happening all the time, not just in the South. In the West, lynching was used as a political weapon. You would come in and lynch your political opponent so he didn't get elected mayor. I mean, this is so. When they're talking about this, it's pretty scary, and so what happened was, his franchise question goes to the city council at the end of 2 years of fighting, and he's expecting his guys on the council to give him what he wanted, but instead the reformers plus some of their allied corrupt politicians blocked him. And this was at a meeting where in the city council room, there's a balcony overlooking the city council chamber. And all of these tough guys were sitting in the front row, each of them with a real rope with a noose on it hanging over the edge of the balcony. So this is the kind of pressure that was being put on the city council people. In fact, some guy took a photograph. A photographer took a photograph, and one of the aldermen thought it was a gunshot, and he leapt under his desk. So what happened was ultimately Yerkes could not had to sell out for much less than what he wanted. On the other hand, he then pocketed something like the equivalent of $5 million to which he was able to take to New York and then to London to do what he needed to do in London. But yeah, Yerkes. This is part of the reason why. And the interesting thing is the mayor of Chicago, Carter Harrison II, whose father himself was assassinated by a crazy Irish immigrant. Carter Harrison later wrote in his memoir that he kind of respected Yerkes for his brilliance and his will, and he didn't like the way that he was corrupt. But he said, the problem everybody else had with Yerkes was that he was major league corrupt, and other business people in Chicago were minor league corrupt. So he knew how to do it in a way that was highly professional, and everybody else was amateurs. So that's why they didn't like him. They all were paying off at, the city council, but he was the one who found the way to do it, at least until the end when they were talking about lynching him.
Right. And so, of course, there's just so much more that we haven't even gotten to about the history, and so I would urge everyone listening to pick up a copy. So, but I'd hate to keep you here all day. But so I'd like to end with the final question. So, since the book has come out, and I know it has come out recently. What is your next project? What have you been working on? What has been taking up your time?
Well, this is going to sound so dull. I'm looking into doing a story about Chicago's street grid, the grid that was imposed on Chicago in 1830, which includes not just the grid of streets but also of alleys. And because Chicago's so flat, the grid extends out into the suburbs and north, south, west, in ways, in distances no other grid can do. In fact, one measure of the size of Chicago's grid is Chicago has something like 1,900 miles of alleys, which is more than any other city in the world. So there's something there about how does a street grid like that, plus other things people make and do to the land, how does that change the way people experience the city? In other words, Chicago feels different from New York and feels different from Los Angeles for a lot of reasons, and these physical things I think have something to do with it. So that's what I'm doing, and who knows if I'll ever get it done.
Interesting. Well, if you do, maybe we'll talk again about it then.
Sure, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very much for talking with me today.
Well, it's been great to be here. Thank you.
To everyone listening, the book is The Loop, the L Tracks That Shaped and Saved Chicago. Thank you for listening and have a great day.